In a country with a functioning government, Joe Biden would have been impeached before the first million illegal aliens crossed over our southern border. But no one did anything to stop it. So now they're arriving at the rate of 250,000 a month. Watch.
Customs and Border Protection sources exclusively tell Fox News more than 250,000 migrants were encountered at the border in the month of December, about as many people living in Scottsdale, Arizona, making it the highest month ever on record. In Eagle Pass, Texas, the migrant surge continues. Local King County rancher Pam Schott had a harrowing experience with migrants on her property.
I looked out the back and I could see 3 illegals walking up to the house. I had gotten a gun, which is an AR-15. I asked them, I said, please, stop, go away, and had the gun in my hands, and they, just kind of looked at me, kind of smiled, and I was like, I'll tow and just go away, and they refused to do so.
They're on the other side of the glass, trying
to get in
and not backing down.
Not backing down. Even though I have a high, powerful rifle in my arms, they are not backing down. That was scary.
The rifle Joe Biden would like to take away from her. So that, writ large, is the biggest story of our lifetimes. It is the one thing Joe Biden has done that cannot be undone. Our great-grandchildren are going to live with the consequences of this, but you never know it from watching most of the news. There's an effective media blackout on Joe Biden's immigration policies and on their downstream effects on America. There are too many strangers pouring in at once, and as a result, the country is becoming chaotic. Here's a rare television news piece on what happened when officials in New York decided to house some of Joe Biden's illegal aliens in a local hotel.
An employee there says that migrants have made an absolute mess of the place. You're standing in front of it. Is that true?
Yeah, well, what we're hearing from that employee is that the hotel is completely overrun. He says, of course, some people just looking for that better life, but as a result, the hotel is a mess, and he fears for his safety.
We don't have any guests anymore. They sold the entire hotel from the 4th floor to the 28th floor. It's all migrants. Mm-hmm. So we got people who are getting drunk, using marijuana. They are punching and beating their wives or their girlfriends. Wow. We have teenagers running around wild around the hotel, opening the fire exit doors and doing what teenagers do in the stairways, and it's a mess.
It's a mess, he said. Of course it is. The whole country is a mess because Joe Biden has ignored immigration laws passed by the Congress. That is a crime, and it has killed huge numbers of Americans, hundreds of thousands dead from narcotics.
Fentanyl has changed the entire game here in San Francisco. You can't buy heroin out here anymore. Nobody sells heroin and nobody uses heroin. Everybody has transitioned over to fentanyl. Fentanyl is the most dangerous drug to ever hit the streets in the United States in history.
Fentanyl has killed more than 70,000 Americans in 12 months. Here in San Francisco, it's the dominant drug. It's responsible for 3/4 of drug overdoses, brazen drug dealing, and rampant drug use. In the shadow of City Hall, the same City Hall residents say actively enabled the fentanyl crisis.
All of it, every gram, came over an open border. So what's notable as a political matter is that every one of these disasters, the fentanyl epidemic, the chaos and crime in our cities, the invasion underway through Texas, Arizona, and California, all of those deeply concern Americans. We're not guessing at that. Polls show it very clearly. By contrast, how many voters do you think are lying awake right now worrying that public officials might violate some obscure federal classification law? None. Not a single person. No one outside Washington cares or even understands the issue. And yet, it is classified documents, not our open borders, that the Justice Department is punishing Joe Biden for. Why is that? What's going on here? Well, it's simple. Washington is protecting itself. Joe Biden alone is responsible for this crime. He alone took home classified documents. He didn't have help in doing that. But allowing the country to be invaded, that's not something you can do by yourself. So if Biden were to be taken down for opening the southern border, a lot of other people would go with him. He had a lot of accomplices. Permanent Washington doesn't want that. And ultimately, and here's the point, permanent Washington is in charge. It's not the democracy you imagine. We're seeing that now. So if you really want to understand how the American government actually works at the highest levels, and if you want to know why they don't teach history anymore, one thing you should know is that the most popular president in American history was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon. Yet somehow, without a single vote being cast by a single American voter, Richard Nixon was kicked out of office and replaced by the only unelected president in American history. So we went from the most popular president to a president nobody voted for. Wait a minute, you may ask. Why didn't I know that? Wasn't Richard Nixon a criminal? Wasn't he despised by all decent people? No, he wasn't. In fact, if any president could claim to be the people's choice, it was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was re-elected in 1972 by the largest margin of the popular vote ever recorded before or since. Nixon got 17 million more votes than his opponent. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign. And in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. How did that happen? Well, it's a long story, but here are the highlights, and they tell you a lot. Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. He often said that. He was absolutely right. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms' telling response? Total silence. But for Nixon, it didn't matter because it was already over. 4 days before, on June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. The first of many dishonest Watergate stories was written by a 29-year-old Metro reporter called Bob Woodward. Who exactly was Bob Woodward? Well, he wasn't a journalist. Bob Woodward had no background whatsoever in the news business. Instead, Bob Woodward came directly from the classified areas of the federal government. Shortly before Watergate, Woodward was a naval officer at the Pentagon. He had a top-secret clearance. He worked regularly with the intel agencies. At times, Woodward was even detailed to the Nixon White House, where he interacted with Richard Nixon's top aides. Soon after leaving the Navy, for reasons that have never been clear, Woodward was hired by the most powerful news outlet in Washington and assigned the biggest story in the country. And just to make it crystal clear what was actually happening, Woodward's main source for his Watergate series was the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt. And Mark Felt ran, and we're not making this up, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was designed to secretly discredit political actors the federal agencies wanted to destroy, people like Richard Nixon. And at the same time, those same agencies were also working to take down Nixon's elected vice president, Spiro Agnew. In the fall of 1973, Agnew was indicted for tax evasion and forced to resign. His replacement was a colorless congressman from Grand Rapids called Gerald Ford. What was Ford's qualification for the job? Well, he had served on the Warren Commission, which absolved the CIA of responsibility for President Kennedy's murder. Nixon was strong-armed into accepting Gerald Ford by Democrats in Congress. Quote, "We gave Nixon no choice but Ford," Speaker of the House Carl Albert later boasted. 8 months later, Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission was the President of the United States. See how that works? So those are the facts. Not speculation, all of that actually happened. None of it's secret, most of it actually is on Wikipedia. But no mainstream news organization has ever told that story. It's so obvious, yet it's intentionally ignored. And as a result, permanent Washington remains in charge of our political system. Unelected lifers in the federal agencies make the biggest decisions in American government and crush anyone who tries to rein them in. And in the process, our democracy becomes a joke. Now, you may have noticed that the very first person in the Trump administration the agencies went after was General Michael Flynn. Why Flynn? Because Mike Flynn was a career Army intel officer who ran the Defense Intelligence Agency. In other words, Mike Flynn knew exactly how the system worked, and as a result, he was capable of fighting back. 4 days after Donald Trump's inauguration, the FBI lured Mike Flynn into a meeting without his lawyer, concocted a series of fake crimes, and forced him to resign. So that's how things actually work in Washington. Let's stop lying about it. Joe Biden, meanwhile, whooped like a hyena when the Justice Department destroyed Mike Flynn. So there is, we have to say, a certain perverse justice in watching something very similar happen to Joe Biden himself 6 years later. Joe Biden does not deserve our sympathy. He's being shafted, but don't weep for him. And yet the rest of us do deserve a better system, an actual democracy. When people nobody voted for run everything, you are not living in a free country. Will Cain is the co-host of Fox and Friend Weekend, the host of the Will Cain podcast, and our friend who joins us tonight. Will Cain, thanks so much for coming up. I think it's very obvious that Biden is being shafted by his own people, people whose identities will probably never come to light. But I find it interesting it's on this traffic ticket offense and not on the fact that he's destroying the country by opening the southern border. Why is no one saying that?
You know, I think it also, Tucker, could even begin in a more entertaining and petty fashion in that I think the story begins with Joe Biden's senility and incompetence, so much so that Democratic politicians and those who have a vested interest in using Joe Biden as a useful idiot go, wow, he's kneeling in front of the Golden State Warriors. Wow, he's calling Kamala Harris president. This guy can't be elected again. He can no longer be our useful idiot. I think his term as their useful idiot has expired. And so they're willing to now indulge in this, as you point out, classified traffic ticket. There's classified documents floating all over Washington in unsecured locations. But what I find fascinating, Tucker, is they're also willing to say that there are potential, we know this, you and I know this, everyone watching knows this, corrupt government deals between the Biden family and foreign adversaries that are antagonistic to the American interest. I'm shocked to see that kind of thing on, for example, CNN now, talking about Joe Biden's brother. And so that leads us to this. If, and I agree with the terminology, if permanent Washington thinks Joe Biden can no longer serve as their useful idiot, he can't be reelected in 2024, it's time to sell him down the river. And it's time to come up with a more important and harder job for them, finding another name.
What's infuriating to me, and again, I just want to say if anyone deserves this kind of treatment, it's the guy who hates the country he leads, Joe Biden. So I'm not weeping for him. But I do think, call me naive, voters ought to be in charge of these decisions. In a democracy, voters get to decide who the president is. They can vote for anyone they want because it's their country. I have to say, I'm wondering how long it's going to be before Michelle Obama starts getting warm and affectionate treatment on CNN.
Well, first, to Joe Biden, and I understand you're not extending sympathy, but I guess here's the moral of that story, Tucker. Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yes.
If you are elected through manipulation of the American public and anti-democratic means, which no doubt about it, the election 2 years ago was anti-democratic at the very least by manipulating the public's access to information and therefore our minds, then you will go down by the very same powers that aided you on your way to perceived power. Now, you have said this, you have mentioned the name Michelle Obama. I think the Democrats are in a real tough spot. It maybe. Or does Gavin Newsom get the treatment you're describing for Michelle Obama? You're going to have trouble, you and I are going to have trouble coming up with any other name outside of those two, I would suggest. Michelle Obama, Gavin Newsom.
Man, if they can sell Gavin Newsom after what he has done to the state of California, then you will know it's all fake. Because no one who lands in LAX is going to vote for that guy.
Hey, Tucker, on the state of the country, I want to say one thing, if I might, about fentanyl. I watched that footage you put up, and it is sad to see zombified Americans sitting there choosing synthetic opioids now over heroin. But the real story of fentanyl is the 16-year-old girl who buys Xanax over the internet and dies overnight. It's the 20-year-old guy who thinks he's buying Adderall. They're still doing something wrong, but they're not overdosing. They're being poisoned by drug cartels and the Chinese Communist Party.
That's exactly right. It's murder. I couldn't agree more. Will Cain, it's great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
So it's been over a year since Alec Baldwin